Hello and welcome to U.S. History. We are going to go over our midterm exam review. This is your midterm exam review, and I'm Professor Jennifer Haynes, and hopefully this will help you be very successful on your exam. The first thing we want to talk about is the college essay. It does have three parts. Your exam has three parts, but I wanted to hit the part that was probably the most complicated. You are going to have, your first part will be matching, where you just match the term with the definition. And the second part is short answer, where you write a whole entire paragraph and you tell everything you know about a certain term, and you'll get to choose from those terms. And then the third part is the essay, and you will be given 3 or 4 essays, and you get to pick one. You're just going to pick one. The essay needs to be 3 to 5 paragraphs, and you need to have organization and a lot of time and thought put into it. That's why I only make you write one essay. So I was going to go over one of our essays, one of the choices, and then show you how to write it, and then it would probably help you a lot with writing it for this midterm exam. So I chose the last question, and it talked about, traditional gender roles are false societal constructs and imaginary boundaries that societies come up with. You're going to compare and contrast. One of the choices was Native American culture with the kind of normal Victorian, it comes from the Victorian era, Victorian societal gender roles for Europeans, okay? So I'm not sure if we have discussed the Cult of True Womanhood yet. That actually has a lot of things in it that are helpful to see what the Victorian gender roles look like, because there's tons of remnants of those today. But I will go over it with you. So I have it color-coded. Hopefully that'll help you. How to write a good college essay. Your step number 1 is to pre-write, or you can brainstorm, or you can have a chart. If you do that and turn that into me, I normally give you 5 bonus points, just because I want you to get into the habit of pre-writing beforehand. So this is a compare and contrast, and you need to make sure that you answer all the questions. I know some of the questions at the end of the essay were like, who's allowed to get a divorce in this culture? Who does the family live with? If there's a divorce, who does the family live with or live close to, the mother's side or the father's side, and that sort of thing. So, and I guess I should also put, patriarchy. I should do that too, because Victorian is definitely patriarchy. Which one of your words, patriarchy, is, where the men in the society hold the power. And I would say Native American culture is a mix of both matriarchy and patriarchy. All right, so we're going to go through these and kind of explain it and help you, get this planned out. And yes, you can use this. Yes, you can use this in your midterm exam. I normally do this in class because I want to get you ready for it so that you know how to do it for the final exam. Okay, so we're going to compare and contrast these two. You have their differences on each side and how they're alike in the middle. You're welcome to add more. I believe I taught a little lesson. I usually teach a little lesson about the Native American culture at the beginning of class, or just because we're looking at different cultures, the African American culture and slavery moving into freedom. We also talk about the early farm culture in America, had a different culture. Women and men were more partners. This is more towards the Industrial Revolution. This is what Victorian is looking like, because they pushed women into the home so men could work in the factories. So all those are at play. But let's just look at the Native American culture. Who did the work in the Native American culture? So I have women actually farmed, and Europeans thought that Indians were crazy for letting women farm, but it works because the men, they hunted, and then so that's their job. Men hunted, women farmed, and when the men brought what they hunted home, they worked together to skin the animal, you know, cure the animal, do whatever needed. So they had a lot of partnerships. And also, even though the women, you know, farmed mostly, it was a partnership during times of harvest and that sort of thing. So they helped each other, which is a partnership that you see that you don't really see in European Victorian gender roles at all. In politics, yes, men were mostly chiefs. They were mostly the chief in a Native American political system. But this is where the but comes in. If there was a war, women were allowed to vote, whether or not they were for it or not, because they were actually the mothers of the sons that would go into battle, which is super important because that wasn't the case in the European world. So when you got married, and, you know, if you look at the Native American culture, women were very much independent and allowed to make their own choices. But when you got married, you would most likely live near the mother's side. So, you know, a warrior and a female Native American got married, they would go live with the woman's mother's side of the family. Divorce, they both could get divorced. But women, all they had to do for a divorce is to set the husband's things outside of the teepee. Now you think about that, oh man, that's harsh, you know? But this is the thing, they didn't have wife beaters. They didn't treat their women poorly because they knew that if they did, all she had to do was take your stuff and set it outside the teepee and you were divorced, okay? So it's really, you know, kept them with a lot of respect for women. Let's see. Women were in control of their own sexuality. Religion. Here's really strange that, you know, what we know of, European society. In the Native American, or we can also say Amerindian society, is that usually the person in charge was a medicine man. So yes, both women and men were involved in religion, but a medicine man, often there were a lot more men involved. The land was communal. Oftentimes they sold land, but it was only for a certain amount of time. And, you know, then when it go back to them, which is actually that's actually in, you know, biblical as well. You know, every 7 years, if you sold land in Old Testament Israel, it would go back to the original owner. So that did happen, and that actually, a lot of historians believe that Europeans knew that. So when they bought the land, they were buying it for private property forever. And they knew that the Indians, you know, it would come back to them after a short time of purchase. But they kind of were deceitful, and that was another issue with land sales. Okay, what else? So the Native Americans only planted what they needed. They never planted more. Okay, they only planted what they needed because they thought that it would mess up the balance. They were very animistic in their religion, so they were, you know, they thanked Mother Earth for, you know, grains and crops. So they were very wanted to make sure not to mess up the balance. They thought if they planted too much, it would destroy the environment. So they only planted what they needed. Men and women were balanced. With logic and emotion. There wasn't one gender was taught to be more emotional than the other. There's actually a person, they had a name for them, a certain type of person in a Native American tribe that portrayed both the strength and warrior and the nurturing mother in one person. And they would have a special name for that person. It was very rare to find that person, but it was just kind of held up as a high standard to be that. In war, if you were a family and you lost your warrior son, what they would do is they would bring, in a Native American culture, they would bring prisoners of war to you, whether it was another Indian tribe or a European, and you could choose, do you want to kill this, you know, prisoner of war because your son died, or do you want to adopt them and, you know, have someone to love that's visible? And 9 times out of 10, they actually adopted and replaced. would replace that person that they had lost. Okay. Slavery. They did have slavery when it was usually usually due to, you know, conquering tribes and that sort of thing. But one thing that Amerindians never did was they never allowed a single baby to be born into slavery. That was totally against their code. All right, and I think that's pretty much it. Things they have in common: women take care of the home for the most part. Both men on both sides hunt. Both, you know, love children, love family, family oriented. Both are, you know, religious, and both farmed. There's probably a lot other similarities. That's just all I was gathering. So the Victorian or gender roles from Europe that were also passed down to the U.S., many of them we can still see. It was a patriarchy. The men really had the source of control. We will talk more about public and private spaces. Public and private spaces, I usually talk about when we're lecturing, and obviously we haven't had lectures face-to-face for a while. That's why I'm making this video. I will also cover that because it's one of your definition, one of your words that could be on your matching. Okay. But public space basically was where men could be. Women were not allowed to be there. So a public space would be work, politics, you know, money issues, education, and that sort of thing. And then the private sphere would have been where the woman had to stay. Men could go in between. Women had to stay in the private sphere, which was the home and church and children. That's pretty much it. They could only be educated if they were going to read the Bible. Okay. All right, so let's keep going. So women were at home in the private sphere, men worked in the public sphere. Politics were only men. Divorce was only by the father, and he would get the children, pretty much regardless. Now that changed in the early 1900s, but I'm talking about for the span of time that these gender roles, these false, you know, gender roles were forming. Okay. And also, you know, we read a lot in grad school. We read a lot about, there was actually a woman who lived in the colonies, and her husband beat her several times. She was married before, her husband had died, she remarried, she had a lot of money. So this husband came along, and it was during the colonial times, the US, when they had 13 colonies. And this horrible husband beat his wife, and I want to say he molested her children, and he would hardly give them any money. And we'll talk more. That's something else down here later. But actually her pastor petitioned the governor of the state of Virginia and asked if she could get a divorce, and they said no. So women really were not allowed to for quite some time. All right. Women were considered property of the man. There's something called coverture in U.S. history. And it's where when you get married for quite some time until the early 1900s, a little bit later, everything that a woman brought into the marriage, the husband was in control of it, whether it's money, houses, whatever. It was not hers. So she was just kind of a silent person. Religion, oftentimes women are portrayed to be more religious, and that men just, you know, kind of show up, but they're not, you know, as a whole. I mean, oftentimes there were pastors and that sort of thing, but that it was more of a woman's deal. Education, men were to get education or be educated and to think. Women were not supposed to think. They were supposed to just be dependent on men, not supposed to worry about money. They're supposed to not ask about money. Only to read the Bible were they to be educated. No voting for women until the 1920s. Obviously, we're talking like 1600 to, you know, 1920s. Women were supposed to only have children. Men decided wars, and women had the sons to send off to war, but they had no say in it. Women were supposed to be raised to be emotional and not to be logical, and for their emotions would control them. And often, actually, they often said that hysteria was a disease of women, and that if a woman was hysterical, she just needed to get married because she needed a man to give her logic and keep her from being hysterical, which is absolutely preposterous. Because you'll see, whether you've talked about it or not, we do a case study of gender in World War I, men and women, and you'll see that the young soldiers are quite hysterical. So it's not a gender thing, that's either way. Okay, in war, they would kill their prisoners, or they would make them prisoners of war. There was no adoption. Slavery, a child could be born into slavery. It was always born into slavery in the European model of slavery. They relied on private land, private property, and you really have to understand this before you get into, like, you know, studying communism, that sort of thing, because in Europe it was different. Only the 2% elite owned land and the church, and the 80% peasants had nothing, and nor could they ever. So land was held and locked and passed down, you know, to the first son of every generation. So that's why, you know, when they came over here to settle, land was so appealing, even though it belonged to someone else. And the Europeans broke over 400 treaties with the Native American Indians, because they wanted that land. You know, they saw that, wow, you know, there's no land in Europe. So that is really central. Also, when they farmed, especially, you know, the 13 colonies, when they were beginning, they farmed so aggressively because of greedy capitalism. There can be capitalism with, can definitely be capitalism with safety guards to take care of workers and for it not to become greedy. But if it has no parameters, no laws to keep others safe, it can really become greedy capitalism. And what they were doing was they were planting way more than they needed to make as much money as they possibly could. And then you have something called the Dust Bowl that comes along later. And the Dust Bowl, it ruined the environment because they planted and planted and planted and planted, never let the land rest. And it kind of ruined the environment for a while, until some things had to be changed. Okay, let me see if that's all. I think that's it. So we have organized what we're going to write, and then what we'll do is we'll have 5 paragraphs, and we will put all of the Native Americans and what their attributes of a culture and gender roles are like. And then we'll do one of the Victorian era and Europeans, and then how they are alike. So I'm going to pause the video and I'm going to set up what your essay should look like. I'll be right back. We're back with what your essay should look like. It needs to be 3 to 5 paragraphs. Good paragraphs, you know, 6 to 8 sentences, and you'll take the information that we had put on our Venn diagram and put it in an organized thought process here. So your first paragraph, you need to just restate the question and set it up. It'll be a smaller paragraph probably. And then your second paragraph, you'll talk all about the Native Americans and their gender roles, you know, how women farmed and that sort of thing. And by the way, European men thought that Native Americans were crazy letting women farm, that they could do it. But it was fine. It totally worked for them. So then you would talk all about the Victorian or European gender roles. And you would talk all about those. And then you would talk about how they're alike in paragraph 4. So you have 2, 3. These should be pretty chunky. How they're alike right here. And then you're going to have a conclusion or sum it up. Now, if you want it to be 3 paragraphs, then you need to make this one, maybe put it together and make it very large. And maybe if you want to put your how it's alike and the conclusion together and make that very large, you could do that. But you really need, I would really work on having the full 5 paragraphs so that you're really writing what you know and what you have brainstormed about. So hopefully that will help you write a college essay in the 5 paragraph system. And you can actually use this one on your midterm exam if you would like to. You still have to write it and that sort of thing, but I just wanted to give you some help in doing so. All right, so that's our college essay. I'm going to post another video about the different sections of your exam. All right, thank you, and goodbye.